This video is about the top 5 costliest mistakes I see in client financial advisor engagements. Most financial advisors are good at what they do. The question is whether what they're doing matches what you think you're getting or what you actually need. This is about how to get the most out of a relationship with an advisor and to avoid these mistakes. These are mistakes and missed opportunities that often fall through the cracks, not necessarily because anyone's doing anything wrong, but because the necessary conversation didn't happen until it was too late. And I've put together a checklist of questions you can bring to your next advisor meeting. That link is in the description. If it's helpful, give that a look. And lastly, before we jump into it, I'm curious to hear what you think about this. What is one thing that your advisor does that you couldn't do yourself? Really curious to see where the answers land on that. Let me know in the comments and let's jump into it. First of all, let's get this out of the way. You've made a smart decision by hiring an advisor. Absent any sort of, burning desire to really dive deep into investment management theory or tax law or anything like that, delegating this stuff to a professional is the right move. But the financial advice industry has many different models. Some are more focused on investments and others take a broader planning approach. And neither of those approaches is necessarily wrong, but they do serve different needs. So I want to be clear, the problem here isn't necessarily bad advisors. I guess that could be the problem, but that's not the problem I'm pointing to here. It's unclear expectations and conversations that aren't happening. What I'm going to give you here is a framework for understanding what comprehensive financial planning looks like so you can make sure that nothing important is slipping through the cracks when you make big financial decisions. So here are 5 areas worth discussing with your advisor because these often get overlooked and they can be costly. All right, so the first area that often falls through the cracks, and this is a big one and it ties into a lot of the later ones, is your tax return. A good question for you to pose here to your advisor would be something like, would it be helpful for you to see my tax return? It's hard for me to imagine an advisor saying no to that question. But here's why this matters. Your tax return by far is the single best snapshot of your financial life. It has your income sources, your deductions, your investments, your real estate holdings, your business interests, and so forth. And by analyzing your tax return, your advisor will be able to verify all sorts of things. For example, they'll be able to see whether you qualify for Roth contributions. I've seen clients show up at my doorstep making Roth contributions when they're way over the income limit. What tax bracket you actually fall in, to what extent Roth conversions make sense, whether you have any capital loss carry forwards that can be put to use, or what deductions and credits that you're taking advantage of that might affect other planning decisions. All this stuff is very important. And here's why I think this stuff falls through the cracks. Many advisor relationships begin first and foremost as investment-focused relationships. And this conversation just doesn't come up. You have an IRA or a 401k that got rolled over into an IRA and you need an advisor to manage it, and that's where the relationship starts, and it just never progresses into your tax return. This is not about your advisor doing your taxes. I want to be clear about that. That's not very common. Most advisors aren't willing to do that. It's a very probably thankless job, but it is about them having your full financial picture. And I think the key takeaway here is that if this hasn't been a part of the conversation, it's worth bringing up, not as like some kind of test for your advisor or anything like that, but simply as a way to deepen the relationship. It's going to help you get more value out of the relationship. And just as a quick story here, I started working with a client couple, business owners, great couple, love them to death. They came on middle of last year, and the first thing I do is I look at a couple years worth of tax returns. That's part of my onboarding process. And I noticed that while they had a minor child, a 16-year-old child, they hadn't been taking advantage of the child tax credit. So of course I asked them, and of course they had no clue that they weren't taking advantage of the child tax credit. So we talked to their CPA. It turns out this was just a small administrative hiccup with the CPA's admin assistant. It had nothing to do necessarily with the CPA, but it was never caught. And because we caught that, we were able to go back, claw back some of those credits, ended up getting $4,500 back for them. We weren't able to claim them all back. You can only go back so far, but it's better than nothing. And it's definitely good that it's not going to be an issue going forward. So that stuff is important. Make sure your advisor is looking at your tax return. Okay. The second area that falls through the cracks are your pay stubs and your employment benefits. This is very similar to the first area with your tax return. It's just something that just doesn't come up. You didn't initiate the relationship that way, and it was never asked. So how do we bring this up? Here's what a conversation starter might look like. You could say, would it be helpful for you if I shared my pay stub or my employer benefits documents with you? It's very hard for me to an advisor saying no to that question, because your employer benefits are often a hidden layer of your financial life, important layer that don't naturally surface in advisor conversations. But here's what your advisor could find buried in those documents. They could find your 401k match, the matching formulas, or the vesting schedules. All that's important. Whether you have access to a mega backdoor Roth, that's super important. That's usually found in a document called the Summary Plan Description, or SPD, if you're curious. They can find out whether you have access to after-tax contributions, options, equity compensation, HSA opportunities, the various pre-tax payroll deductions that you're taking advantage of. All this stuff is very important. So if it's so important, why does it often get missed? Why aren't advisors asking about it? Well, advisors typically see your 401k statements or your 401k balance. That's fine. But they don't often see the plan details. Depending on how many clients your advisor has and how much time they have, it's not something that's going to be proactively asked about necessarily unless you bring it up. So your job in this situation is to bring that information to your advisor and help them to complete the picture. And I think that key takeaway here is that your workplace benefits might be one of your biggest wealth building tools, and making sure your advisor understands them can surface opportunities that neither one of you knew existed beforehand. So make sure that your advisor takes a look at your pay stub and your employer benefits documents. All right. So the third area that falls through the cracks, this ties back to the first two, are tax projections. And this is especially important before big decisions. So the key forward-looking question here might be something like, before I make this move, I don't know what the move would be. Maybe you're discussing a Roth conversion or something. Before I make this move, can we take a look at what it does to my taxes next year? This is where financial planning and investment management often diverge very clearly, because these are situations that don't necessarily neatly tie back to portfolio management, but they're clearly very valuable. But here's some important situations where you would definitely want to run tax projections. If you're selling a business or you have a concentrated stock position that you're trying to wind down, that's very important that you run those projections, because both of those are going to be taxable events. Exercising stock options is important. Roth conversions, capital gain or capital loss harvesting is important. Retirement timing, large charitable contributions, all of those things are important to know how they're going to affect your taxes. And the only way you can know that is by running a projection. And here are why these projections don't happen sometimes. First of all, tax projections probably require a degree of coordination between your advisor and CPA, and a workflow isn't always between the advisor and CPA isn't always built right into that relationship. They might not necessarily even know each other. But if your advisor had asked for a copy of your tax returns at the beginning of your relationship, or at any point, I guess, in your relationship, they might have actually access to software to run those projections independent of a conversation with the CPA. Although I think it would be good to loop the CPA in on any of these decisions anyway. I think that just makes good sense. And I want to be clear about this again. This isn't about your advisor doing your tax returns. Your advisor is probably not going to want to do your tax returns, but this is about modeling decisions before you make them so that there are no surprises later, and so that you can see if the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak. So the key takeaway here is that If you have a big decision coming up, retirement decision, Roth conversions, exercising stock options, equity compensation, you name it, asking for a projection is a very reasonable request, and a good advisor will welcome that request. Okay, so let's talk about the fourth area that falls through the cracks, and this is household level asset allocation. The question to raise here is, are we looking at my accounts individually, or are we looking at them on a household basis? Are we looking at all of them, all of the financial accounts that my household holds together? And here's why this matters, because risk and asset allocation aren't account by account. They're cumulative across everything you own. So you can't look at your accounts individually. You have to look at everything together. And here's where these gaps can appear. You might have an IRA that is perfectly invested. It's perfectly rebalanced, but that doesn't mean much if your spouse's 401k hasn't been reviewed and is poorly invested or way out of balance or throws your overall allocation way off. Or maybe you have a very diversified portfolio, but you have significant concentration in a business or a privately held stock or something else, somewhere else in your finances that aren't being looked. Or maybe, and this happens a lot, maybe you have multiple accounts with different custodians. This is really common among us, particularly among older folks. You have multiple accounts across different custodians, and no one at the custodian, in any one of those custodians, has a full picture of your finances. This isn't necessarily anyone's fault. It's just that a full picture requires intentional, sort of proactive coordination. So the key takeaway here is that raising this question can prompt a valuable conversation about whether anything important is sitting outside of the frame of reference. Your asset allocation in any one account may be less important than you think when you look at the entire picture of your household. And how you invest the assets in any one account can change dramatically depending on how the other accounts that you have are invested. Okay, so our last area that falls through the cracks sort of ties back to the third one, is an articulated portfolio philosophy. And here's what I mean by this. This sounds a little abstract, but this is a question you can ask. Can you walk me through the purpose of each holding in my portfolio? This isn't supposed to be a gotcha question. It's supposed to be a chance for you to, or for your advisor to articulate the why behind your investments. Because what sometimes happens is that portfolios accumulate funds through multiple strategy changes. This can especially be true in taxable accounts, where advisors might be hesitant to offload funds or holdings because they're afraid to realize gains, and so you end up with a really messy portfolio with dozens and dozens and dozens of funds, and nobody can really say what the job of any one of those funds is. You just have a bunch of investment funds. I've noticed a tendency with some clients to show up with multiple funds holding overlapping positions with nobody really noticing or questioning why. So they'll have multiple funds, and, you know, it's going to be hard to find a large cap domestic fund, for example, that doesn't already have exposure to Microsoft or Apple or Nvidia or any of those, you know. So you might have half a dozen of those funds and they all have exposure to these same positions. A well-constructed portfolio should be explainable in plain English. This does X, this does Y, and here's how X and Y work together. Each asset class should have a unique role in the portfolio, and often each asset class only needs to be represented by a single fund, not multiple funds. So we don't want to duplicate efforts here. We don't want to make things messier or more complicated than they need to be. But I think this conversation benefits everyone. It's a chance, again, for your advisor to re-articulate the strategy and for you to feel confident in it. And the key takeaway here is that if it's been a while since you've had that conversation, it's worth revisiting, especially if you have much more than a handful of funds in your portfolio and you're kind of confused by what's going on. It's good to develop that clarity. I think clarity is valuable for both sides. Okay, so let's put a bow on this. Let's bring this all together. These 5 areas all have something in common. They all require someone to initiate the conversation. They don't just automatically happen. And this isn't about assigning blame or finding fault with anybody. Many advisors are excellent at what they do. The question is, whether the relationship is set up to include financial planning or just portfolio management. Sometimes it's a scope issue. You might have a great investment advisor who would be happy to do broader planning, but just was never asked about it. But sometimes it might be a fit issue, and you might need a different kind of relationship than you currently have. Either way, you're now equipped to have a better conversation and to uncover those gaps. So you don't have to do this all at once. My advice would be to pick just one of these areas to bring up with your advisor. It's not a test, it's just a conversation. And I think good advisors will appreciate the conversation and be happy that you raised it. Again, I've put together a checklist of those questions. You can get that in the link in the description. These questions, there's just 5 of them, and they'll help you guide the conversation. You could just do one, per quarter, or however often you meet your advisor. You could do 5 all at once. It doesn't really matter. The point is that they give you a framework for understanding what comprehensive financial planning looks like, if that's what you're looking for. And of course, if you want a second set of eyes, or maybe half a set of eyes on your plan, just to make sure that nothing's falling through the cracks, that's something I do all the time at my firm, UVest Advisory. I'm happy to talk about that. All right. And before I sign off, I'm curious if any of these areas surprise you, or maybe which one surprised you the most. Let me know about that in the comments. All right, my name's Erik Goodge. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.